legislative body, and they'll serve his state and our nation with distinction. Note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll. Mr. Alexander. Zayat.
Consent to call the quorum be terminated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, before we have this dignified ceremony, I want to say one thing about Cory Booker. I've talked about his great academic record, but for me, a frustrated wannabe athlete, his most impressive qualification as far as I'm concerned, he was a tight end for one of the Stanford great football teams.
The chair lays before the Senate a certificate of election to fill the vacancy created by the death of Senator Frank Lautenberg of New Jersey. The certificate, the chair is advised, is in the form suggested by the Senate. If there is no objection, the reading of the certificate will be waived and it will be printed in full in the record. If the senator-elect will now present himself at the desk, the chair will administer the oath. Right there. Come on up here, Frank. Bob, okay. Would you please raise your right hand? Put your left hand on the Bible. Do you solemnly swear that you will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that you will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that you take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that you will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which you're about to enter, so help you God?
I do.
Congratulations, Senator. Welcome to the Senate. Where are we here?
What's up? We have 2 minutes prior to this vote.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
It's my understanding we're going to move now to a matter, if we're moving to the nomination of Mr. Watt,
Correct.
I yield back the time for the majority and the Republicans.
Without objection, the time is yielded back, and under the previous order, the clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Melvin L. Watt of North Carolina to be Director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, signed by 18 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is there a sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Melvin L. Watt of North Carolina to be Director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency for a term of 5 years shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays have been ordered under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Balkus, Mr. Beckidge, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee,
I was thinking the same thing. Yeah, I know, but yeah, I know.
Mr. Levin,
I was thinking the same thing. Yeah.
Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Robert, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, I did. Mr. Schott, Mr. Schumer, yep, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado,
That's the advantage.
This is not going to work. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Beckich, Bennett, Booker, Boxer, Brown, Cardin, Casey, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Franken, Gillibrand, Heinrich, Hirono, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, Manchin, Menendez, Mikulski, Murray, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Schott, Shaheen, Stabenow, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, and Wyden.
That was my
I don't mean to interrupt, especially after he showed him without me. Thank you. She'll be good. She's had a heart valve surgery. It's very common, but recovery is long.
Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Chambliss, Coates, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Hatch, Hoeven, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson, Wisconsin, Lee, McConnell, Risch, Scott, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, and Wicker. Mr. Bozeman, no. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Mr. Grassley? Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Sessions? Mr. Sessions, no. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Heller, no. Mr. Burr, aye. Ms. Collins? Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Johnson, South Dakota, aye. Mr. Harkins, aye. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Cochran, no. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson, aye. Mr. Kirk, no. Coburn? No. Ms. Ayotte? No. Mr. Kane? Aye. Mr. Roberts? No. Mrs. Hagan? Aye. Ms. Murkowski? No. Mr. King? Aye. Mr. Blunt? No. Ms. Merkley? Mr. Merkley? Aye. Mr. McCain? No. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed of Nevada? Aye. Mr. Tester? Aye. Mr. Portman? Aye.
I know who to pick. You think I'm bullshit? You all right? That's great. Oh, I love it.
Mrs. McCaskill? Aye.
He told me a fantastic story.
Mr. Carper? Mr. Carper? Aye. Ms. Cantwell? Aye. Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Aye. Mr. Paul? No. Mr. Rockefeller? Aye. Mrs. Feinstein? Aye. Mr. Murphy? Aye. Mr. Blumenthal? Aye. Does he want to make... Mr. Reed of Nevada? No. vote or change their vote.
Anyone in the chamber wishing to change their vote? The vote on this are 56 yeas, 42 nays, 3/5 of the Senate duly chosen and sworn, not having voted in the affirmative. The motion is not agreed to.
President,
The Majority Leader.
enter a motion to reconsider the vote by which cloture was not invoked on the Watt nomination.
The motion is entered.
Can we have order?
The order in the Senate. Tammy, it's all yours, kid.
You can ask for 2 minutes.
Madam President, Madam President,
The senator from Vermont.
Madam President, I ask consent that there be,
Need the nomination.
Madam President, I'll wait till the nomination is reported, then I'll.
Under the previous order, the clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the standing rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Patricia Millett of Virginia to be United States Circuit Judge for the District of Columbia Circuit, signed by 17 senators.
Madam President,
The senator from Vermont.
I ask consent that there be 2 minutes equally divided in the usual format.
Without objection.
Madam President, can we have order in the Senate?
The Senate will be in order.
Madam President,
Senator from Vermont.
Patricia Millett is an outstanding nominee who deserves to be treated on her merits. No argument has been lodged against her that would rise to the level of an extraordinary circumstance. If the Republican caucus finds that despite her amazing, stellar legal reputation and commitment to our country that somehow a filibuster is warranted, I believe this body is going to have to consider anew whether rules change should be in order. You know, Republican senators are going to, if Republican senators are going to hold nominations hostage without consideration of individual merit, we will have drastic measures. I hope the same senators who came forward to broker a compromise when the Republicans shut down the government will decide here to put politics aside and vote on the merits. I hope the same senators who said judicial nominees should not be filibustered barring extraordinary circumstances will stay true to their word. 10 years ago, for the same seat, John Roberts, President Bush's nominee, received a voice vote by the Senate. Today, President Obama's nominee to that same seat, Patricia Millett, is...
The senator has used 1 minute.
I thank the chair.
Madam President.
The senator from Iowa.
Yes. I want to show you why this seat doesn't need to be filled. These are the other circuits. The average of those other circuits is 383 caseloads. This circuit, the D.C. circuit, has 149. So workload doesn't demand it. Secondly, we're in a situation where this administration has said that if Congress won't, I will. He's going to do by executive orders. This is the court that can rule for or against the executive orders of this administration. We need to maintain checks and balances of the government. Secondly, each one of these seats costs $1 million, not just a year, but every year for the rest of the life of those judges serving full time. And so that's why I ask you to vote against this cloture motion.
Sent to 2 more minutes, equally divided.
Without objection.
Madam President, I'm sure the senator is concerned about costs. Same senators were not concerned when it cost the taxpayers billions of dollars for an unnecessary shutdown of the government. But I would note, under President Bush, there were 11 judges on that court with a lower caseload. Now there are 8 judges with a higher caseload. The numbers are the numbers. President Obama is being treated differently than President Bush was. Patricia Millett is being treated differently than John Roberts was. It's not fair. It's not an extraordinary circumstance. There is no justification for it.
Madam President.
The senator from Iowa.
what that doesn't take into consideration is that there are 6 senior status judges on this court. The Chief Judge, Garland, told us that their workload is the equivalent of 3 1/4 judges. So presently, there is enough judges to go around that equal 11 1/2 judges, 8 judges there now, plus the 3 1/2 that have or 3 1/4 that have senior status. There's plenty of a reason not to fill any more seats on this court.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Patricia Millett of Virginia to be United States Circuit Judge for the District of Columbia Circuit shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
No.
Hatch and Lee, Isaacson.
Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Beckidge. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken. Yes, sir. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin. Yes, sir. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative. Baldwin, Baucus, Bekich, Blumenthal, Booker, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Coons, Donnelly, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson, South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, Manchin, Markey, Menendez, Merkley, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, and Whitehouse. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Senators voting in the negative. Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Grassley, Heller, Hoeven, Joe Hans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Lee, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Portman, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, and Wicker. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Kurt, no. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Durbin? Aye. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch? No. Mr. Bennett? Aye.
We are. Yep.
Mr. Brown? Aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada? No.
Do you want me to ask if we still... Have all senators present voted, or does any senator wish to change his or her vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 55, the nays are 38, and 3 senators responded present. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative The motion is not agreed to.
President,
The Majority Leader.
I enter a motion to reconsider vote. My motion was not invoked on the nomination of Ms. Millett.
The motion is entered.
I ask unanimous consent to Senate recess until 2 p.m. and that at 2 the Senate proceed to pre-morning business for debate only until 6 p.m. with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection, so ordered. The Senate stands in recess until 2 p.m.
The Senate is in recess, subject to the call of the chair after earlier blocking the nomination of former Representative Mel Watt of North Carolina to head the Federal Housing Finance Agency. We will have live Senate coverage when they return here on C-SPAN 2.